You learn a lot about people, not when they're smiling at you, but when they think you're beneath them. That's something I figured out the hard way. Not as a young woman, but as an old one, a tired one. The kind of old woman who says, sure, too often, and I'm fine, even when she isn't. The kind who, when you walk through her kitchen, smells like rosemary and burnt toast, and maybe a little like regret. That morning, I was folding Julia's laundry. Yes, her laundry. My daughter-in-law. Her blouses, her workout clothes, those ridiculous tiny bras I didn't even want to touch. She'd dropped him off, along with baby Matteo, the night before, saying she didn't have time to finish it all before her conference in Naples. Can you just, she said, pushing the basket toward me with a practiced smile and air kisses that missed my cheek. I didn't say no. I never did. It wasn't just about Matteo, it was about Luca, my son, her husband, who'd once slept on my chest during fevered nights and cried when I first left him at kindergarten. I had raised that boy through widowhood and double shifts, through lean years and winters with broken heaters. When he married Julia, I told myself this was a good thing, that she was modern, assertive, sharp. I mistook sharp for strength. That was my mistake. At 10:17 a.m., I heard the email ding on my old iPad. I dried my hands and tapped it open. Subject: re-miss time, invoice. I blinked. What? The message was short, professional, even. She thanked me for my time, clarified that due to my last-minute cancellation of babysitting duties 2 days earlier, when I had a doctor's appointment to check the pain in my hip, she was applying a standard fee penalty to account for lost wages and backup childcare costs. Attached was a PDF. It had a logo she clearly whipped up on Canva, and a watermark that said Professional Nanny Services at the bottom. At first I thought it was a joke, then I read the line she highlighted in yellow. Please settle within 3 business days. This ensures transparency for all sides going forward. I put the iPad down gently, like it might explode. For a moment, the kitchen felt too quiet. I could hear the clock tick over the sink. The boiler hummed low. Matteo, asleep in the next room, made a small grunt in his nap. That boy. He was the only soft spot left in that whole cold house they lived in. The 80 didn't hurt. Not the number, at least. What burned me, what lit something I didn't even know was still inside me, was the assumption that all these months of rocking her baby, changing diapers, mashing bananas, wiping spills, singing lullabies, and staying past my limits was something they believed could be itemized, billed, debited, corrected. When had love become a transaction? I opened the fridge. The milk was still half full. Matteo's formula was on the second shelf. I closed it again without taking anything. I walked slowly to my desk drawer and took out a pen. I didn't scribble down a response. I didn't call her, or Luca. I didn't even cry. I just wrote, 80 tonni, penalty. Then underneath, I added in red ink, March 14, 1994, private school application fee, June 5, 1998, emergency dental surgery, August 21, 2004, bailout for his first failed job venture, October 2010, down payment for their first apartment. I stared at the list and kept going. Not because I was angry, not yet, but because my hands needed to move, because I needed to remember I had given something, over and over. Not just my time, but my bones, my sleep, my retirement fund, my youth. And I realized something else, something sharp. They only value what you put a price on. For years, I had framed my love in silence, folded it into clean socks, spoonfuls of soup, late-night pickups, and homemade biscotti. But silence, it turns out, is easily mistaken for servitude, for obligation, for worthlessness. I stood up and walked to the fridge, pulled the invoice off the screen, and pinned it to the door with a magnet shaped like Sicily. It stayed there all day like a challenge. That evening, when Julia came to pick Matteo up, she barely looked me in the eye. She had her sunglasses on, even though the sun had already dropped behind the hill. She picked up the diaper bag, checked the bottle, and said, "Everything okay?" "Perfect," I said. "Thanks again, and sorry about the email. Just something we're trying to standardize with childcare now that I'm working more hours. You understand, right?" I nodded. She left. I stood at the kitchen sink for a long time after. The dishes were washed, the towels folded, the night air drifted in through the screen, and I whispered to no one. "Standardize this, Julia. That night, I pulled out the real books. Not the notebooks I kept on the counter, but the ledgers from the storage closet, the ones I'd filled through the decades, rent receipts, grocery tabs, checks I wrote for Luca's tuition. All of it. I made a fresh cup of espresso, no sugar, sat down at the table with my glasses and a calculator, and got to work. I hadn't opened the blue ledger in nearly 10 years. It was buried under old blankets in the linen closet, beside a rusted sewing box and a stack of VHS tapes I kept pretending I'd convert someday. The cover was soft from age, the corners worn down like a well-loved book. Inside, 3 decades of inked lines, faded receipts, folded bank slips. Every euro that ever left my hands for my son's sake was in there, marked, dated, and silent until now. I set it down on the kitchen table, like a sacred text, and pulled out my old calculator, the buttons gummy but still responsive. It still made that faint beeping sound, like a tired sigh with every tap. March 1994, private school deposit for Luca. August 2002, Julia's immigration legal fees. January 2010, down payment on their first Fiat. June 2015, full week of babysitting while they went to Paris. The numbers didn't lie, they never do. For every month of their marriage, there had been some contribution, financial or physical, from me. Not once had I sent an invoice. Not once had I asked for repayment. Because love, real love, isn't a billable service. But if they wanted to attach a price to care, then I would show them exactly what it cost. Not out of pettiness, not even anger, but clarity. By the time I looked up from the table, it was past midnight. My hands ached. My back felt like glass. Still, I kept going. I began drafting a formal letter, just like the one Julia had sent. In light of recent discussions regarding value exchange for childcare and related services, I've compiled an itemized summary of unpaid maternal labor, financial contributions, and domestic support provided since. It felt absurd, even writing it. But then I remembered the way she had clicked her tongue when I mentioned needing to reschedule last week's babysitting. You know, some of us can't just take the day off, she'd said. I remember blinking, biting the inside of my cheek, and nodding. She didn't know, would never know, how many times I had taken the day off from being a person to be a mother, to be a support system, to be the only reliable thing in someone else's life. The next morning, I visited the print shop in town. The owner, Luca Sr., no relation, raised an eyebrow when he saw me enter with my folder. "Official business, Rosa?" he asked, grinning. I smiled. You could say that. While the printer churned through page after page of my invoice, I watched the totals grow, line by line on the screen. By the end, the numbers stared back at me like something out of a dream. Not adjusted for inflation, not counting the nights I stayed up rocking Matteo while they went to wine tastings, not counting the meals I cooked when Julia had her book club or spa day, or when Luca worked late and forgot to call. Just the concrete things. The things I could prove. The printout was 21 pages long. I slid them into a navy blue folder. I added a sticky note in my neatest handwriting. "Since we're placing a value on love, here's mine." Then I walked to the post office. The clerk asked if I wanted tracking. "Oh yes," I said, "very much." When I returned home, I made myself a café and sat on the back step, watching the chickens peck at the dirt. The sky was clear, the village quiet. I could hear a distant radio from a neighbor's window. I felt something shift inside me. Not vengeance, not bitterness. Something steadier, like I had just finally closed a door that had been swinging open for too long. 2 days later, Luca called. I didn't answer. He called again, then sent a text. "Mama, what is this? Julia's freaking out. Please call." I didn't. The next day, Julia texted. "We need to talk. This is completely inappropriate and uncalled for." I put the phone down. Instead, I pulled out a fresh notebook, not for records, not for bills, for something I hadn't done in years, writing for myself. At the top of the first page, I wrote things I gave without asking anything in return. Then I listed my last biscotti when Luca was sick with the flu, my bed after their heating broke, my best tablecloth for their wedding dinner, my silence, too many times to count. I didn't know what this would become, but I knew I wasn't going to be silent anymore. They had made me invisible through convenience. I would become visible through fact. That evening, someone knocked at the door. I peeked through the curtain. It was Luca. Alone, I let him stand there. Not out of cruelty, but because sometimes silence is the only way to make a man listen, especially one who's never learned what his mother's hands really held all those years. He knocked for the second time, softer than before. I stood in the hallway just beyond the curtain, coffee cooling in my hand. The door between us might as well have been a mountain. I could see Luca's outline through the frosted glass. Tall, slightly slouched, his hands stuffed in the pockets of the coat I bought him 2 winters ago. He didn't ring the bell. He didn't call out. He just waited. I let him. It was the first time I'd ever done that. For 30 years I'd opened the door for him without hesitation. Opened my purse, my schedule, my arms, my sleep. But today I kept the lock in place and let him learn what it felt like to wonder if he was still welcome. He knocked again. Then silence. I turned away and walked back to the kitchen. My espresso was now cold, but I drank it anyway, staring out the window at the fig tree I planted the year Luca was born. It had bloomed late this year. Small, stubborn fruit barely hanging on. I understood that. My phone buzzed again on the counter. I didn't need to check. I knew it would be Luca. I wiped the rim of my mug with a napkin and placed it down deliberately on the saucer. At some point, you stop trying to be understood and start insisting on being respected. For too long, I had accepted the small humiliations that come with aging, being talked over, being forgotten during holiday plans, being praised for help I was expected to give. They called it love, but it had become convenience dressed in gratitude. And now they were uncomfortable because I'd said no. Not with a scream, not with a slap, but with math, with silence, with a well-structured folder that forced them to look at years they had taken for granted. That afternoon, I took down my calendar from the wall. I flipped through the coming weeks, one square at a time. Doctor's appointment on Tuesday, church bazaar meeting Thursday, Mateo's birthday next Sunday. Though I had a feeling I wouldn't be invited this time. I picked up a pen and wrote something in next Friday's square. Start over. I didn't know what it meant yet, but it felt necessary. The next morning, I was hanging laundry in the courtyard when I saw her, Julia, standing by the gate with her sunglasses on and arms folded like a substitute teacher ready to scold a child. Rosa, she said. I didn't answer. She opened the gate without asking and walked in like she still believed the world would always yield to her. Her heels clacked against the stone tiles as she approached, the same expensive pair she wore to Mateo's baptism. I think we need to talk, she said. I think you should leave, I replied, not unkindly. She blinked. Not used to resistance from me. This whole thing, your letter, the invoice, it's unnecessary, it's theatrical. I pegged the towel to the line, the wooden pin snapping into place like punctuation. You sent me a bill, I said. I responded in kind. She sighed, looking around as if to find an ally in the lemon pots, or the old plastic chair in the corner. I just thought, maybe it would give us all a clearer understanding. Boundaries. Expectations. I turned to face her fully, hands on my hips. I raised your husband. I fed him when you were still a teenager. I paid his tuition, paid your wedding planner when your parents fell short, held your child when he had a fever while you were at a spa. I never asked for anything, but now that I set a line, you call it theatrical. She opened her mouth, but I kept going. Do you know what it costs to give someone your life, Julia? I don't mean money. I mean the parts of yourself you never get back. The knees ruined from scrubbing, the sleep lost, the jobs declined so I could be home for every field trip, and stomach flu. I didn't write all that in the invoice, but I remember it. She looked away. I saw the flicker of guilt, or maybe calculation. I'm sorry if the message came off wrong, she said. We were under stress. I know what you thought, I interrupted. You thought I wouldn't push back. She was quiet. I took down a dry pillowcase and folded it neatly in my arms. You don't have to apologize. You don't even have to agree. But you do have to understand one thing. I am not a resource you can schedule and deduct. I'm a woman, a mother, a person, and I will not be handled. Julia nodded once. Not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. Then she turned and left the way she came, her heels sounding thinner somehow, like chalk on stone. When she was gone, I sat down on the old plastic chair, my legs suddenly heavy. I watched the sheets sway in the breeze and felt the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from effort, but from years. Still, beneath it, something else had begun to take root. Not bitterness, not revenge, certainty. The thing about silence is that it doesn't just protect, it accrues interest. When I was younger, I mistook quiet for grace. I thought if I bit my tongue and kept moving forward, if I didn't complain, didn't burden anyone with the ache in my knees or the emptiness in my bank account, that it somehow made me stronger, wiser, even noble. But all it really did was teach people how to ignore me. I sat in the kitchen that night with the invoice folder still on the counter, untouched since I'd returned from the post office. I hadn't even filed it away. It felt like a guest that hadn't left yet, solid, stiff-spined, silent. The air in the house was heavier now, though I couldn't decide if that was sorrow or relief. I got up, opened the cabinet above the fridge, and pulled down the good dishes, the ones I hadn't used since Mateo's baptism dinner. They were slightly dusty white, with a fading gold rim. Nothing extravagant, but they reminded me of a version of myself I used to love, the one who used to cook for people without feeling invisible, the moment dessert was cleared. I rinsed them carefully, warmed up leftover soup, and poured myself a glass of red wine, just half full. I sat at the table and ate alone, candle lit, music low, using the good dishes for no one but me. For once, that was enough. I looked around at the house, its chipped tile corners, the crack in the plaster near the ceiling, the drawer that always stuck, and felt something strange. Ownership. Not just legal ownership, though that was mine too. Emotional ownership. This house had seen me bend, not break, and I wasn't going to let anyone else rewrite my worth inside these walls. The next day, I took the bus into the next town. Not to visit anyone, not to run errands, but to think. I walked through the market slowly, not buying anything, just observing. There were couples arguing over tomatoes, children crying over pastries, two old men playing chess at a cafe like they'd been sitting there since before the war. Then I noticed a woman about my age stocking shelves behind the counter of a small used bookstore. Her hair was long and pinned back with a pencil, and she wore mismatched earrings and soft leather shoes that looked older than my son. But her hands moved with intention, stacking, straightening, tidying. She caught me watching and smiled. "Looking for something?" she asked. "No," I said, "just passing through." "Passing through is the best way to find something unexpected," she said. I smiled back. "Maybe I'm looking without knowing it." She tilted her head. "That's how I found this place. Came in looking for a birthday card. Bought the store instead." I blinked. "You own it?" 3 years now, after my divorce. I figured if I'm going to be overlooked, I'd rather be surrounded by stories. I laughed, soft and surprised. "I know that feeling." We chatted a few minutes more. She told me about poetry nights they hosted in the back, about the handwritten thank you notes pinned on the wall, about how she now got to decide what stayed and what left her shelves. Before I left, she handed me a small book without a price tag. "Gift," she said. "It's about a woman who spends her whole life tending everyone else's garden before realizing she forgot to grow her own." I carried it like it was made of glass. On the ride home, I thought about my garden. Not the rosemary and basil outside the kitchen door, but my inner one. What had I tended? What had I let wither? Not my son. I had poured water over that boy's life, every single day. Not Julia. I had tolerated her thorns, her cold soil, her frosty silences. But me? I couldn't remember the last time I had done something purely for the woman I was, not the roles I filled. Back home, I made a pot of chamomile tea and sat in the armchair with the book. I didn't read it. Not yet, just held it. Something about its weight made my chest feel less empty. That night, I opened a fresh page in my notebook. On top, I wrote, "How I will grow from here." Then, beneath it, "I will not apologize for setting boundaries. I will not measure my value by how easy I make life for others. I will not wait to be asked if I'm okay. I will remember that silence is not the same as peace." I closed the notebook slowly. The next day, I opened my windows wide and let the wind carry the scent of rosemary through the house. I scrubbed the floor tiles, I pulled down the old curtains and hung up the new ones I'd bought last year. but hadn't bothered to install. I vacuumed the cushions and moved the armchair by the window where the light was softest in the morning. And then, with no one watching, I danced a little. Not well, not with rhythm, but with something like joy. Not because anything had been fixed, but because something inside me had finally shifted. I once heard someone say that it's never too late to change your life, only too late to ask permission. So I stopped asking. 3 days after Julia left my courtyard with her practiced silence and tight smile, I walked to the notary's office in town. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to feel the weight of my own decisions, documented, certified, etched into something permanent. Paper speaks louder than tears ever could. The notary, Signora Lavetti, was a small woman with a clipped voice and a silver necklace that clinked every time she leaned forward. She had handled my husband's will years ago. Back then, I was the one in the chair, trembling, trying to understand the legal words that made my widowhood real. This time, I wasn't trembling. "I'd like to revise my living will," I told her. She raised an eyebrow, then nodded. "Do you have a current one on file?" "Yes. Drafted in 2011. Before Matteo was born. Before I knew who my son would become." She didn't ask questions. She just pulled out the old file. I sat across from her for nearly 2 hours, reviewing each clause. I removed Luca as sole medical proxy and added a neighbor I trusted, Giorgio, who always brought me tomatoes and checked my locks after storms. I revised the clause about guardianship in case of emergency, removed Julia from anything related to the house, and updated my power of attorney. And then came the inheritance clause. "Do you want to keep Matteo listed as a secondary beneficiary?" she asked, pen poised. I hesitated. The boy wasn't the problem. He was innocent, a child. But one day, he'd grow up in that house, with those values, those ideas about who mattered and who didn't. "Yes," I said finally, "Matteo stays. But not through his parents." She nodded, and made the change. By the time I left the notary's office, my steps felt steadier than they had in months. It wasn't about punishing them. It was about reclaiming what I'd quietly surrendered. Back at home, I took the revised documents and slid them into the navy blue folder with the invoice. I tucked it inside the locked cabinet in the pantry, the same one where I'd once kept emergency sugar and preserves for Luca during lean years. Now it held something just as vital, proof that I'd stopped waiting to be treated right. That night, the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. "Hello? Rosa." It was Julia's mother, Chiara. I hadn't spoken to her in over a year. We were cordial, but not close. She was the type to air kiss and immediately check her lipstick in her phone screen. "I just got off the phone with Julia," she said, voice tight. "She's very upset." "I imagine she is. She says you're tearing the family apart." I chuckled softly. "I sent a folder, Chiara. That's not a hammer. It's a mirror." There was a pause. Then, "She's saying you're threatening legal action, that you've rewritten your will out of spite." I sat down in the armchair, watching the wind flutter the curtain. "No, I rewrote it out of clarity. And frankly, that's nobody's business but mine." Chiara exhaled heavily, but I could hear something else in her tone, a crack in her composure. "She's afraid of losing face. You know how people talk. Let them," I said. "Maybe they'll learn something." She didn't reply, just murmured a soft goodbye and hung up. The next morning, Luca called again. I answered this time. "Mama, please, can we meet?" I said yes, but not at the house. I didn't want Julia hovering in the next room, whispering instructions. I chose the small cafe on the corner of Via Sorel, where the espresso came in thick porcelain cups and nobody asked you to hurry. He arrived late, unshaven, tired, like someone who hadn't slept well in days. He ordered a coffee and barely touched it. "I didn't know she sent you that invoice," he said first. I said nothing. "I found out afterward. I told her it was wrong." I sipped my cappuccino. I don't know when things got this bad." I looked at him, really looked. This was the boy I'd carried across train platforms when his legs gave out. The one I'd stayed up with during flu season, who once cried when he thought he lost a school project. But now his eyes looked through me, like I was a riddle he hadn't studied for. "Things didn't get bad," I said. "They got seen." He frowned. "We didn't mean to take advantage. We just thought you wanted to help." "I did," I said. "And I still would have, But help doesn't mean servitude. It doesn't mean silence. And it sure as hell doesn't come with a receipt. He looked down. You hurt me, Luca, I said gently. Not just with that invoice, with every time you let her speak over me, dismiss me, schedule me, like I was a cleaning service. You didn't stand up for me. You let me become a fixture. I'm sorry, he whispered. I know, but sorry doesn't rebuild things. Action does. We sat in silence for a while. Then I added, I've made changes to the will, not to punish you, to protect what's left of me. He nodded slowly. Do I still have a place in it? You have a place in my life. If you earn it. He winced, but didn't argue. When we stood to leave, I didn't hug him. Not because I didn't love him, but because love without boundaries is just exhaustion. After the cafe meeting, I didn't hear from Luca for 4 days. That silence used to scare me, used to make me feel like I'd done something wrong, like I had to fill the gap with apologies, warm food or late-night texts asking, are we okay? But this time, the silence felt like space, like a room I could finally stand in without shrinking. On the 5th day, a small envelope arrived in my mailbox. No stamp, no return address, just my name in Luca's handwriting. Inside there was no note, only cash. 850 euro bills, folded neatly. A reimbursement, I realized, for the invoice Julia had sent. I placed the bills on the table and stared at them. For a long time. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. But I understood the gesture. It was an attempt at closure, at rebalancing a scale that had long since tilted past breaking. I didn't return the money. Instead, I took it into town the next morning and walked into the children's library near the municipal hall. The place smelled of old paper and pencil shavings, the walls lined with watercolor paintings from school visits. A young woman behind the counter smiled at me. Can I help you? Yes, I said. I'd like to donate. She blinked. A book? No, I said, and handed her the envelope. A monthly story hour. Volunteer-led, snacks provided. No charge. Use this to start. Her eyes widened. That's very generous. I shrugged. Let's call it a return on investment. She wrote down my name, offered me a clipboard, and before I knew it, I was penciled in for Saturday mornings. That afternoon, I baked a sheet of fig cookies and dropped a tin at Giorgio's gate with a note thanking him for being my new medical proxy. He called later and left a message that made me laugh out loud, something about upgrading from tomatoes to legal status. Later that week, I walked through my house slowly, seeing it like a visitor might. I made small changes. I removed the photo of Luca and Julia from the living room shelf, not out of spite, but to free up space. I replaced it with an old black and white picture of my mother and me in the garden, both of us smiling with dirt-streaked cheeks and sunburned noses. A different kind of legacy. Then I opened the cabinet where the navy blue folder lived. I took out the papers again, not to revise, not to rage, but to read. I traced the signatures with my finger. Each line felt like a closing chapter, and yet it also felt like a key. I hadn't just protected what I had left. I'd reclaimed it. That night, I took my dinner outside, a bowl of minestrone, a slice of bread, and a glass of red wine. The courtyard was quiet, the sky streaked with lavender and rose. I thought about how many meals I'd eaten standing over a sink or at someone else's table, pretending not to notice I wasn't really included in the conversation. Now I dined with the crickets and the fig tree, and somehow it felt more like belonging than any family dinner I'd had in years. The next day, I received an email from Julia. It was short. Rosa, we got your message loud and clear. I'm not going to argue about what's fair, but for the sake of Matteo, I hope we can find a way to be civil. Let us know if you're willing to talk. Julia. No apology, no warmth, just positioning, damage control. I didn't reply. Not immediately. Instead, I printed the message, folded it, and slipped it behind the last page of my ledger. Then I sat down and wrote a new kind of note. A letter for Matteo. One I'd give him someday, maybe when he turned 18, or when he asked why his nonna stopped coming around every Tuesday. Dear Matteo, I loved you from the moment I held you. I changed your diapers, wiped your mouth, sang to you when you wouldn't sleep, and made silly faces to stop your cries. I was there, every day, because you were joy when everything else felt like duty. But love, real love, also means Knowing when to say enough. It means showing people how to treat you by how you treat yourself. One day, I hope you understand that. I will always be here. Not in their house, maybe, but in every fig tree, every song, every story told with heart. Love, Nonna. I placed the letter in an envelope, sealed it, and wrote for Matteo when he asks across the front. Then I returned to the window and watched as the neighbor's dog barked at nothing and the sky turned a darker blue. I didn't feel triumphant, but I felt whole. And sometimes that's the better kind of victory. Saturday morning arrived with soft sunlight and the scent of warm bread from the bakery below my building. I tied my scarf, packed the little storybook I'd chosen for the library, and stepped out into a day that already felt like it belonged to me. I hadn't read aloud to a group of children in years. Not since Luca was in primary school and asked me to volunteer for his reading hour. That was long before Julia, back when Luca still thought my voice was magic and my lap was the best seat in the world. The library was cozy and well kept, tucked between a stationery store and a small trattoria. When I arrived, I was surprised to find 6 children already waiting in a semicircle of tiny chairs. Their parents lingered near the door, distracted but grateful. The librarian I'd met earlier, Clara, welcomed me with a smile. "The snacks are in the corner," she whispered, "and we've got apple juice for after." I nodded, took a breath, and sat down. The story I chose wasn't famous. It was about an old tortoise who outlives everyone in the forest and builds a garden no one believes will bloom. But she tends it anyway, quietly, faithfully. And in the end, it does. As I read, something in me relaxed. The children leaned in. One girl placed her head on her hands. A boy whispered the tortoise's name as if she were real. By the time I turned the last page, the silence was warm and full, not awkward. "Do you think she was lonely?" a little girl asked. I smiled. "No, I think she finally had room to be herself." Clara clapped softly, and the parents offered polite applause. I stood, bowed slightly, and felt a flush of something new, not pride exactly, not performance, presence. Afterward, Clara handed me a folded paper. "Just a little thank you," she said. Some of the parents chipped in for the next snack rotation. I waved it off. "Use it for more chairs. We might need them next week." That afternoon, I walked through the market and bought myself a new chair cushion, deep green velvet with tassels, a ridiculous indulgence for someone who'd lived most of her life on practical seating. But I wanted a chair that was mine, shaped for me, not passed down or shared or borrowed. I placed it on the chair by the kitchen window and sat. The view wasn't grand, just rooftops and birds and a cracked satellite dish, but it felt honest. That evening, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door to find Matteo, alone. He clutched something in both hands. A small Tupperware container. "Mama made too much pasta," he said, looking unsure. "She said I could bring some." I nodded slowly and stepped aside. "Come in." He walked in, like someone who wasn't sure he was allowed. His eyes darted around the living room, pausing on the rearranged photos and the new chair cushion. "You changed stuff," he said. "I needed a few things that were mine." He nodded. I took the pasta and placed it in the fridge without comment. "Sit down if you like." He lowered himself onto the edge of the couch. Not like he used to, when he would stretch out and grab the remote and pretend he was the man of the house. We sat in silence for a moment. Then he blurted out, "Why'd you send that thing?" I looked at him calmly. "Because your mother sent me one." He shifted in his seat. "But you didn't have to go that far." "I didn't go far," I said. I went honest. He didn't like that. I saw it in the wrinkle of his brow, the way he folded his hands between his knees. "Nana says you used to take care of everyone, that you did everything." I tilted my head. Did she say that with admiration or warning? He didn't answer. I leaned forward. "Matteo, listen to me. Taking care of people is good, but not if it means you disappear. Not if it means they forget you're a person too." He looked at the floor. "Mama says you're mad at us." "I'm not mad. I'm awake." We sat for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up. "Can I still come sometimes? Even if Mama doesn't?" My heart tugged. "Yes," I said, "but only if you want to, not because anyone sends you." He nodded, then reached into his backpack and pulled out a small notebook. "We're supposed to write letters in class. Can I write you one? You can, I said, and I'll write you one back. He smiled for the first time in weeks. When he left, I stood at the door watching him go. He didn't look back, but he walked a little straighter. Later that night, I sat in my new green cushion chair, opened my own notebook, and wrote, "Today, I was not a background character. Today, I read a story. I received a letter, and I bought a chair that no one will ask to borrow." It sounds like nothing, but it's everything. The following Monday, I received an envelope in the mail, cream-colored, heavier than usual. I recognized the handwriting immediately. Julia's. Not the loopy, romantic cursive from the wedding thank you cards, but the new version, tighter, more calculated, as if each stroke had to prove something. Inside there was an invitation. Matteo's school play. There was no note attached, no warm greeting. No, we'd love to see you there. Just the printed details. Thursday evening, 6:00 p.m., school auditorium. I turned it over in my hands. The irony didn't escape me. For months, I'd been treated like a convenience, an appliance, useful when needed, invisible when not. And now I was being offered a front row seat to applaud on cue, not as a mother-in-law, not as a person, but as a placeholder. Still, Matteo's name tugged at me. I folded the invitation and placed it on the fridge with a small magnet, one of the ones he had made me in kindergarten. A crooked clay heart with smudged fingerprints. That week, I cooked less, cleaned less, sat more, sat in my green velvet cushion chair with a book in my lap. But not always reading, just breathing. I caught myself watching the clock more than usual on Thursday, 5:15, 5:45. Then I stood. Not to leave, but to close the curtains. I didn't go. I imagined the auditorium lights, the rows of parents fidgeting with programs, the shrill hum of a microphone, the rustling of paper wings on cardboard costumes. I imagined Matteo scanning the crowd, wondering if he'd see me. And maybe that was the hardest part. But I had to draw the line. They couldn't use him as a leash to tug me back into servitude. Instead, I made myself a plate of roasted vegetables, poured a glass of lemon water, and turned on the old radio. A waltz came on, and I danced in my socks across the kitchen floor. A small rebellion. A quiet revolution. The next morning, Clara called. "We're planning a little mural for the library wall," she said. "Something cheerful. Would you come sketch an idea or two? You have such an eye for stories." I almost laughed. Me? Artistic? But I said yes. At the library, I met a few of the other volunteers, 2 retired teachers and a widower who used to run a bakery. We gathered around a long table with paper and colored pencils like schoolchildren on a rainy day. I drew a lemon tree. Not perfect, not proportional, but real. Its trunk was crooked, its branches stubborn, and in the soil beneath it, I wrote one word, root. Clara clapped when she saw it. "That's it," she said. "That's exactly the feeling we want." Afterward, we had espresso and shared stories about bad dates, broken toasters, and first loves. I hadn't laughed that much in years. On my way home, I passed a dress shop I used to glance at but never enter. Today, I stepped inside. The clerk, a woman younger than Julia, but with the same sharpness in her gaze, greeted me with cautious warmth. "Looking for something special?" "No," I said. "Something ordinary, but mine." I walked out with a linen dress, the color of rain clouds, and a silk scarf with lemon blossoms on it. Extravagant? Maybe. But so was 30 years of unpaid devotion, and no one ever batted an eye at that. That evening, I heard the familiar thud of Matteo's footsteps outside. He knocked once, then peeked his head in. "Nonna?" "In the kitchen," I called. He came in and held out a paper program, slightly wrinkled. "I saved this for you." I took it. His name was listed third from the top. Tree Chintu. Matteo Rossi. "You were a tree." He nodded solemnly. "But I had a line. Did you remember it?" He grinned. "Of course," I said. "Even the smallest roots hold strong." I raised an eyebrow. "You're sure that wasn't my line?" He giggled. We sat for a while, and he showed me a video someone had filmed on their phone. I watched him speak his one line, arms stiff at his side, but eyes bright. I applauded softly. "Bravo. Amore." He hesitated. "Why didn't you come?" I looked at him, because I needed to make sure that when I do show up, it's on my terms. not because someone wants to look like a good person. He didn't quite understand. Not yet, but he nodded. And that was enough. He stayed for soup and helped me water the rosemary pots before leaving. When I closed the door behind him, I didn't cry. Instead, I pulled down the invitation from the fridge, folded it neatly, and placed it in the same envelope as my letter to Matteo. Someday, he'd understand. And when he did, he'd have the story in full. A few weeks passed, long enough for the weather to shift into the cusp of spring, sunlight sharpening, shadows shortening, citrus trees starting to bud. The kind of weather that makes people remember their manners just in time for Easter. Julia texted me. Just 4 words. We'll be hosting lunch. No, hello, no, we'd love to see you. Just a passive little assertion, as if I were an employee waiting for my schedule. I stared at the message and let it sit there. I didn't respond. Instead, I pulled out an old envelope where I kept unused RSVP cards from years past, weddings, baptisms, a retirement party I was invited to and seated near the door like a coat rack. I took a blank card and wrote, "Thank you, but I'll be spending Easter with friends." Then I sealed it, addressed it to their house, and mailed it the next day. They'd know what that meant, and if they didn't, well, that was their burden to carry. I had no intention of going back to a table where I was only welcome when someone needed an extra pair of hands to pour coffee or slice bread. Instead, I called Clara and asked if the library group was doing anything for the holiday. She laughed. "We're planning a misfit brunch. Everyone brings something. Everyone leaves with leftovers and a story." I told her I'd bring lemon biscotti and my famous egg pie. Easter morning arrived with a quiet kind of joy. I wrapped the biscotti in paper towels and carried the egg pie in a wicker basket, walking slowly past flower stalls, waving at the baker's wife and the retired bus driver who always wore the same green cap. When I arrived, the back room of the library was already buzzing. Folding tables covered in bright cloths, bowls of olives and fresh ricotta, a cheap speaker humming an old Mina song. There were no perfect centerpieces, no seating charts, just chairs that creaked, and people who listened. I was handed a mimosa in a paper cup. Clara clinked a spoon against her glass and said, "Today is for everyone who's ever been left off the guest list." We all raised our drinks. Someone's granddaughter read a funny poem. An old man named Tito told a story about the time he accidentally catered a wake with birthday balloons. And when it was my turn, I said simply, "I brought lemon biscotti." They were Matteo's favorite. I used to make them just for him. Now I make them because I still love the recipe, even if the guest list has changed. People laughed, then clapped gently. Later, Clara pulled me aside. "You know, Rosa, there's talk about starting a community kitchen night. Nothing fancy, just shared meals, recipes, stories. Would you host the first one?" I blinked. "Me? You've got the warmth for it." And that egg pie nearly started a riot. I agreed, before my nerves could argue. That night, I returned home with a full heart and an empty pie dish. I placed it in the sink and noticed for the first time in a while that my house didn't feel like a waiting room anymore. It felt lived in, earned. I put on soft music and opened a notebook, not my usual one for budgeting or grocery lists, but a fresh one, a lavender cover, a gift from one of the Storytime kids. On the first page, I wrote, "Things I no longer owe. Explanations for choosing peace over performance. An apology for resting. Justifications for saying no. My weekends, my silence." Halfway through listing, my phone buzzed. Another message from Julia. "We left a gift on the step for Matteo's reading. He wanted you to have it." I opened the door. There it was, a slim parcel, carefully wrapped in brown paper. I brought it inside, wary but curious. Inside was a handmade bookmark, watercolor lemons, and the words, "To Nonna, who taught me stories have roots." It was unmistakably Matteo's handwriting, slanted and sincere. For a moment, I sat with it in my lap, unsure what I felt. Then I slid it into my current book, the one about late bloomers and overlooked heroines, and whispered, "Thank you." But I didn't reply to Julia. I didn't need to. The gesture didn't undo years of small erasures. It didn't erase the bill she'd sent, the smirks, the mockery. But it did offer a new path forward, one paved not through her approval, but through Matteo's love. That was enough. The next morning, I called Giorgio. "Still have those extra lemons?" I asked. "Plenty." Want to bake something? No, I said. I want to plant something. We dug a hole in the soil beside the rosemary, near the courtyard wall. I pressed a young lemon tree into the earth with my own hands, packed it down, watered it. Give it time, Giorgio said. It'll bear fruit. I'm in no rush, I replied. I just wanted to root something here, something that's mine. 3 Sundays after Easter, I received a voicemail. Ciao, Rosa, Luca said, voice cautious. We're hosting dinner next weekend. Nothing fancy, just hoping you'll come. Matteo would like it. He paused, as if waiting for me to speak, forgetting, of course, that voicemails don't work like that. Then he added, no pressure, just wanted you to know the door's open. I played the message twice, not because I needed to hear it again, but because I wanted to understand the tone. It wasn't commanding, not quite apologetic either. It lived in that strange gray space between guilt and obligation, where grown sons go when they don't know how to face the past, but still want dessert. I didn't call back. Instead, I went to the garden and watered the lemon tree. Its roots had taken. New leaves had appeared, small, glossy, full of nerve. There was something fearless about them, pushing up through soil they didn't ask for, but had claimed anyway. I liked that. The following Saturday, I made myself dinner, roasted eggplant with garlic and parsley, a small bowl of lentils, and warm bread I'd baked with Clara that morning. I set the table for one, lit a stubby candle, and placed a cloth napkin on my lap like I was dining in a restaurant. It was the same night as their dinner. But I didn't go. And this time, it wasn't an act of protest. It was a choice made from peace. For so long, my presence at their table had come with a hidden script. Smile modestly, eat what's served, offer help, know when to disappear. I'd played my part until I'd started believing it was the only role I could have. Now, I had rewritten it. At 7:42 p.m., my phone buzzed again. A photo. Matteo, holding a plate of pasta, grinning with his crooked front teeth and an apron tied around his waist. The message read, I helped cook. I smiled. Genuinely. I replied, save me a recipe. No more, no less. After washing the dishes, I walked to the kitchen window and watched the courtyard bathed in moonlight. The rosemary danced in the wind, and the lemon tree stood still, defiant. There was no applause, no witnesses, but I had never felt more whole. The next morning, I found a letter in my mailbox. From Luca. Handwritten, folded into thirds, like the ones I used to leave in his lunchbox. Mama, I don't know how to undo what's been done. I don't know how to make up for years of letting you carry so much while pretending it was just normal. Julia and I, we're still learning, still failing, sometimes. But I wanted you to know that I see it now. How much of our lives were built on your back, and how little we gave back. Thank you for everything, and I'm sorry. If you ever feel like having dinner, one just for us, say the word. Love, Luca. I folded the letter and placed it beside Matteo's bookmark. Not forgiveness, but recognition. A small, tender seed. That afternoon, I walked to the community kitchen, where I'd promised to host the first shared meal. Clara and the others were already arranging tables, lining them with mismatched cloths and borrowed plates. I'd brought 2 loaves of focaccia and a jar of fig jam. Before we began, Clara handed me a small pin in the shape of a lemon blossom. For our kitchen steward, she said. You're the root under this little tree. Everyone clapped. I flushed with surprise, not embarrassment. Later, as we served soup and laughed over spilled wine and mixed up desserts, someone asked me if I had a big family. I used to think so, I said. Now I think I just have a small one I chose. When the evening ended, I walked home with the pin still on my jacket and crumbs in my pocket. I passed Julia and Luca's street without flinching. I didn't wonder what they were doing. I didn't imagine a seat left empty for me. Because I had finally built a table of my own. And every chair there had my name on it. The call came on a Thursday morning, just as I was kneading dough for sweet bread. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, checked the screen, and let it go to voicemail when I saw it was Luca. I finished shaping the dough, set it aside to rise, and poured myself a cup of coffee before listening. His voice was tight, embarrassed. Hey, Mama. Look, there's some issue with the credit card. Julia was at the pharmacy and it declined. Said something about authorization revoked? Can you call me when you get this? Just want to figure out what happened. I set the phone down and stared out the window. The lemon tree's leaves were still wet from the early rain, shimmering like they'd just been polished by the sky. I took a sip of my coffee, calm, because I knew exactly what had happened. Weeks earlier, quietly, firmly, I had reviewed the accounts that were still connected to my name. When Luca took over handling my bank errands after my surgery 2 years ago, I'd let some things slide. Too tired, too trusting. I signed forms I hadn't read, let him set up auto drafts, handed him a joint credit card, just in case. That just in case had become groceries, takeout, a ski trip I wasn't invited to, and monthly cosmetic boxes under Julia's name. I hadn't said anything then. I'd been too exhausted, too unsure if it was worth the fight. But now I had quietly closed the joint account and transferred the credit line into a separate account under my name only. I'd left enough for any emergencies Matteo might face, but everything else, cut clean. No ceremony, just a signature at the bank. And one final, no more. I called Luca back later that afternoon. "Ciao," I said when he answered. My voice was steady. "Mama, did you do something to the card?" "I did," I said. There was a pause. "We had expenses." "I'm aware, and none of them were mine." Another pause. It caught us off guard. You could have warned us." "I wasn't warned when I was charged for spa treatments and sushi dinners. I never ate." He sighed. "It's not like we were stealing from you." "No," I said calmly. "You were just spending from me. There's a difference, but not one that matters anymore." He didn't speak. I added, "The bank account is in my name again. The will is updated. The house is no longer part of the estate you think you're entitled to. I've made sure Matteo has what he needs. Beyond that, there's nothing left for you to manage." "Mama, come on." "No," I said, and the word surprised even me with its weight. "I'm done being your backup plan, your safety net, your unpaid subscription service. You're punishing us." "No," I replied. "I'm liberating myself." He hung up, and I stood there, in my kitchen, the smell of rising dough and roasted garlic curling through the air, not shaking, not crying. I was steady, rooted. I spent that weekend preparing for the second community meal. This time, I brought marinated artichokes and a photo album Clara had asked me to share, old pictures of the village in the 70s, weddings and harvests, and silly costumes for carnival. As I passed the album around, one of the younger volunteers pointed to a photo of me in my 20s. I had a head full of curls, a baby on my hip, and flowers streaked across my face. "Is that you?" she asked, laughing. "It is. You looked wild." "I was," I said. "I forgot that for a while, but I remember now." Later, I helped clean the dishes while people sang softly in the background. Someone strummed a guitar. The smell of lemon zest and red wine filled the air. When I walked home that night, I saw Julia in her car, parked just a few blocks from my building. She was alone, staring at her phone. I didn't approach. I didn't wave. I simply walked past. Because not every storm needs to be faced. Some are meant to pass while you stand dry on your own porch, arms crossed, unmoved. Inside my apartment, I changed into soft clothes, placed the leftovers in the fridge, and lit a candle beside the letter Luca had written me. Not for him, for me, to remind myself that no matter how they framed the narrative, I had reclaimed the pen, and I was writing my own ending. About a month after the credit card call, I received a letter in the mail, not a bill this time, but an offer. One of those official envelopes, with a thick paper insert and a real signature at the bottom. A local restoration group, one I'd spoken to briefly during a community event, had reviewed my home as a potential site for conversion, an artisan cafe and cultural hub, blending historical preservation with new life. The proposal was ambitious, and the money was real. They were willing to buy my house outright. Cash. No conditions, no delay. At first, I folded the letter and put it under a basket of onions, letting it sit like an idea too hot to touch. But over the next few days, it kept speaking to me. It wasn't just about money. It was about finally choosing what to leave behind, and to whom. For years, that house had been the crown jewel in Luca and Julia's eyes. They assumed it would be theirs. Not because they earned it or loved it, but because they felt entitled to it. When Luca was 12, I'd made him plant a fig tree in the back garden. He cried about the worms and the dirt. Now I couldn't imagine him lifting a finger to care for it. Still, I had clung to the house as something sacred, until I realized the house wasn't what made me sacred. I was. So I said yes. I signed the papers quietly, with a notary and a warm cup of espresso beside me. I didn't announce it. I didn't send a group message or leave clues. I waited for the call that I knew would come. It came on a Wednesday evening. Julia, her voice clipped. Did you sell the house? I did, I answered, folding laundry. You didn't even tell us. I didn't think I had to. I'm the owner. I made a decision. But what about Matteo? His memories? I laughed softly. You mean the ones where I was told to sit in the kitchen while you hosted Easter in the dining room? She went quiet. Then, we assumed it would stay in the family. That's the thing, Julia. I've redefined family. Click. She hung up. I sat back on the sofa, folded a dish towel with deliberate care, and whispered to myself, goodbye, crown jewel. The money from the sale wasn't life-changing, but it was freedom-changing. I used part of it to rent a small but sunlit apartment closer to the library. Top floor, no elevator, but I didn't mind the stairs. Each one reminded me I still could. I furnished it simply. A round table for two, shelves filled with novels and lemon-themed ceramics. A single guest bed, small, intentional. I wasn't hosting the world anymore. Only those who came with open hands and honest eyes. The rest of the money, I set up a trust in Matteo's name, one he wouldn't access until he was 25. No early withdrawals, no loopholes, just a quiet future seated by someone who remembered every scraped knee, every lopsided drawing. I also donated a portion to the community kitchen, in honor of every woman who'd ever fed others while going hungry in more ways than one. On moving day, Clara and Giorgio helped carry boxes. Matteo came too, wearing mismatched socks and holding a basil plant. It's for your windowsill, he said, so it smells like Sunday. I hugged him tightly. You've always known how to bring the right things. Later that afternoon, I stood in my new kitchen, bare, clean, and bright. The walls were blank. A fresh beginning. I opened a box marked sentimental and pulled out a photo of young Luca holding baby Matteo. His face was soft then, untouched by pride. I placed it on the shelf beside my storybooks and handwritten letters, not to forget, but to honor what had been good before it turned. That night, I cooked lentil soup and played Nina on the radio. No interruptions, no footsteps above or voices behind closed doors. Just the sound of me, fully myself, without someone else defining my value. I fell asleep with the windows open, and the basil plant breathing beside me. The final straw arrived in a thin white envelope, addressed in Julia's slanted, overconfident script. I opened it without rush. Inside was a typed invoice, detailed, itemized, almost professional in its absurdity. It listed dates, hours, and even line items. January 3rd, 3 hours watching Matteo while I had my dental appointment. February 18th, 2.5 hours, delayed train pickup. March 7th, 1.25 hours, errand run. Total 63.75 hours of childcare. Amount due, 60. It was stamped, final reminder. I laughed out loud, one of those disbelieving, breathless laughs that comes not from humor, but from clarity. The audacity wasn't even shocking anymore. It was just confirming. They had never seen me as family. Not really. They had seen me as labor. So I sat down at my new round table. I pulled out one of Matteo's old sketch pads I kept for grocery lists and notes, and I began writing. Not with spite, with truth. In vote for lifetime contributions, Rosa Mancini. 30 years of housing Luca, rent-free, including meals, laundry, and emotional support. 18 years of packing lunches, attending school meetings, and volunteering at events. 12 years of unpaid weekend childcare to support their travel and social events. 6 months of cooking during Julia's postpartum recovery, including overnight care. Countless hours of advice, emergency pickups, late-night talks, birthday gifts, and hand-sewn costumes. 1 heart surgery recovery, handled alone. 1 trust fund created for grandson. 1 house preserved with my sweat, sold with my name, and now entirely beyond their reach. Total amount due, Because this debt was never theirs to pay. It was mine to release. And I had. I printed the invoice, signed it, and mailed it in the same envelope they'd sent me. I didn't wait for a reply. I didn't expect one. Because the act wasn't about provoking guilt. It was about ending the transaction. Later that day, I joined Clara at the library. She was assembling a photo board for the upcoming Village History Week. I saved a spot for your lemon tree, she said, nodding to the space in the center. It's become a bit of a symbol, you know. A tree, I said, raising an eyebrow. Clara smiled. Not just a tree, a woman who planted roots after being uprooted. We pinned a photo of me crouching in the soil, hands in the earth, eyes forward. I stared at it a moment longer than I meant to. Do you miss them? Clara asked gently. I didn't flinch at the question. I miss who they pretended to be, I said. But I don't miss who they were when they thought I'd never leave. That evening, I returned to my apartment and placed a lemon tart in the oven. Giorgio was coming over with a bottle of his homemade limoncello, and we had agreed to play records and trade stories like two old gossips. While the tart baked, I reread Matteo's bookmark. Tanana, who taught me stories have roots. He hadn't called me in a few weeks. But that was all right. Sometimes children drift before they return. Sometimes they don't. Either way, I'd left him something true. Not just money, but a model. A woman who stopped saying yes to keep the peace and started saying no to build her own. When Giorgio arrived, he held up 2 lemon glasses and said, "To stubborn women and new chapters." I raised mine, to sending the final invoice and never chasing the payment. We clinked glasses. I bit into the tart. The crust flaked just right. The filling had a kick of zest. Like me, unexpectedly bright, a little sharp, but entirely my own creation.